That was our old friends Dimmu Borgir with their orchestral version of the song Gateways from the album Abrahadabra. Welcome to the wide world of wargaming, a fun, fascinating hobby that puts you in the boots and situations of famous commanders. This is Hexes and Soldiers, episode number 27. My name is Jason. How in the heck have you guys been? Hopefully, just dandy. I'm doing fine. Life is grand. Is that convincing? No, it is. Life is good. Welcome, to episode 27, and I guess you could call this episode "So You Want to Be a Field Commander." And I have somebody specific in mind. Perhaps you have already guessed. We'll get to that in due time. As far as shoutouts go, I will say hey to anybody that war games and leave it at that. And we're all one big happy family. Let's try and keep it that way. What's new? Well, a couple of things. A couple unrelated game topics. I runned. That is to say, I ran. Or I went running, if you will. My my esteemed associate runs, and she does this up to 5 miles at a time. And I thought, I can do that. I'll give it a shot. You know, give in and engage in an activity that she does. Maybe it'll bring us that much closer. I think I made it 2 miles and I was done. And the 2 miles that I ran, I didn't run straight. I ran, walked, ran, walked. Was fairly proud of myself. And then, after about 5 miles, I was told, which I had finished a long time ago, she was still going strong. And I don't know how. So I've gained the knowledge that if some mutated sewer creature was to emerge and come after me, I could get away up to about 2 miles. If I paced myself after that, I would be sewer creature dinner, but at least I could hold my own for a couple of miles. And I had a career change yet again. It seems like I'm playing hopscotch all over the job market, but yeah, no more post office. I was not fired. I faithfully and respectfully resigned for various reasons. No hard feelings held by either party, but parted ways, and I thought it would be a while before I found a replacement, but it was no time at all. Now I've found another job, and we'll see how that goes, and thankful for that. So, what else? Talked to my brother, as I am known to do on occasion, and he has finally confessed to me that after all this time, he has achieved burnout when it comes to computer games, and I'm surprised this didn't happen sooner, to say the least. But anyway, I didn't want to rub it in or be insulting, but I was relieved to hear that. And his question that was posed to me was, I want a game. I want it now. I don't want to have to wait for a freaking pre-order. I don't want to have to pay, an inordinate fee for something that's out of print. What can I get now that is a good World War II solitaire game? And as he lives in St. Louis, I pointed him in the direction of Miniature Market. You know, they have a giant warehouse there, but not only that, they have a little brick and mortar store that they have attached to their giant warehouse. So I checked to see what they have in stock, and they had a few things. France 40 from GMT, and a couple other games that I thought he would be interested in, but he was more interested in something that was specifically designed to be played solitaire, and that really only left, I think, Field Commander Rommel, which I have never played, and the D-Day at Omaha Beach game that also I have never played. But I left it up to him, and he picked the D-Day game, so I'm curious to see not only what his opinion of that game is, but what it's like for a guy who used to be one of the hardcore board war gamers back in the day and went digital and then went back. I'm very interested to see how that feels, and we'll get the scoop on that for you and have it at some point. But yeah, I'm very curious to see what that feels like, and I hope I never have to go through it. I intentionally keep myself away from computer games and such because, as I've stated in the past, A, I'm afraid I'll like them too much, and B, I just have too many freaking conventional war games that would just sit and collect dust, and I can't do it. I don't have it in me, and I don't want to do it. I enjoy the things way too much. Why would I give it up? Um, I guess you'll have to wrest them from my dead, prying hands type thing. Anyway, below the last episode, I think I posted something by the way of if anybody has any suggestions for show topics or wants to say whatever it is that they might want to say. Provided a couple forums for them to do that, but got a couple of responses, and among them would be from Itinerant Hobbyist, who asked about series games. Why play them? How many scenarios do you need to play? Uh, do you need to play scenarios more than once, or do you play non-series games? Well, I thought about this not too in depth, but to be honest with you, series games, why play them? Now, if I understand the question correctly, basically, why bother with them? Well, you bother with them because you find a system or you hear about a system that is fantastic and you're curious yourself, so you learn it. But not only that, once you learn it, you now have a basis for playing a ton of other games that have either been released or will come out. And you don't have to keep learning a whole another rule system, which is always a plus. What else? How many scenarios do you need to play? Or should I say just how many scenarios do you need? Well, I don't know. If you get a lot of scenarios, you feel like I guess maybe you're getting what your money's being well spent. If you buy something and it only comes with one scenario, well, it doesn't seem like you've got much for your dollar plus. Well, yeah, you're gonna get tired of playing the same scenario over and over, I would presume. But how many do you need? I don't know. I guess it depends. Depends on the subject that you're trying to simulate, and it depends on the designer. So that varies, obviously. So I don't know that I answered that too well. Do you play scenarios more than once? I do, and have, and will continue to do so. It just depends on the scenario. If I really dig a scenario, and I think the outcome could have been a lot different, or I barely lost, or something to that effect. Yeah, I'm then intrigued and challenged, and only feel even more inclined to try it again. Obviously, if it sucks, there's another benefit of having multiple scenarios. If you play a scenario and it sucks, then you have something else to fall back on. So maybe the more scenarios, the better. I don't know. Do you play non-series games? Sure, yeah. I play both. As far as series games go, I think ASL would be a series game. The OCS series, wouldn't that be technically a series game? Conflict of Heroes could probably be considered a series game. I like series games and non-series games. So hopefully, Mr. Itinerant Hobbyist, I answered some of your questions. And another suggestion as far as a game review was posted by Pedro Estrada. And that suggestion dealt with tackling a world at war. I don't know that I will be doing that anytime soon. If nothing else, because I don't own the thing. What is more, it's not cheap. And finally, I just don't know that this is the game for me. I don't know if this is up my alley, as it were. Maybe perhaps a bit too strategic, if that makes any sense, unless I misunderstand the game's premise. But telescoped out a little too much for me. I need to focus in a little more when it comes to gaming and not feel perhaps so alienated from what I'm doing. I don't know if that makes any sense or not, but that's all I got. I appreciate the suggestion, but probably will not be tackling that. So, playtesting is still moving along. I fell a little behind and am catching up again. I am now working on the second day scenario, and this would be for the Gettysburg game that I'm playtesting for Shenandoah Studios. And this is a longer scenario with a lot more units involved, but not so many movement restrictions. So it's kind of exciting actually, and the Confederate States, you can plan and incorporate a lot more strategy as such. So, a lot of interesting things going on, and I will be documenting this as I go and posting it for your leisure and some other stuff. When will, and I've complained about this repeatedly, but when will the solitaire expansion for Conflict of Heroes be available? And I've seen everything and anything posted regarding this. Meanwhile, time keeps ticking and no Conflict of Heroes solitaire module. Well, I saw an interesting reply regarding this, and this would be from ATS Gamer, aka Mr. Anthony Salvaggio. How you doing, man? Um, he said that the solo expansion is employing the latest in board game design techniques, and it is a mixture of emergent AI and stealth technology, and it does. But this solo expansion, apparently, he says, is so good you can't even see it, and you could be playing it right now and never know it. So that's an eerie consideration to think that this thing is already out and I've been playing it and not knowing it. And in that respect, I wish it wasn't so successful so I could enjoy it more, but I thought that was entertaining. And then I had a couple scattered thoughts. Perhaps I'll go more in depth in future shows, but I thought maybe you guys should consider what your Rosebud game is. And I guess you could also call this your Desert Island game. But I like the Rosebud analogy better, and if any of you have seen Citizen Kane, you know what I mean. If you haven't, well, it's time you've seen it. It's a classic. Not just because they say it's a classic, but it is a classic. But your Rosebud game would be the game that perhaps you started out with but never came back to, or a game that you loved at one time and again, for whatever reason, you had a falling out with it or you never came back to it, would like to do so, never have. Your Rosebud game. So, some that bears consideration. I don't know. May give you guys something to think about as well. And then food for thought. Literally, food and wargaming. I thought that would be a good topic to tackle, perhaps sometime. Pizza is just the universal food when it comes to board games in general and anything, I guess. But specify this. Be more specific, and I think I could come up with a few things. I got one off the top of my head. When it comes to OCS games, you're gonna want the a burrito from Chipotle, and you're gonna want this because not only is it fantastic, probably the best burrito you're gonna get, but the thing is huge. And I also remember reading somewhere back in the day, um, in the acknowledgments or something in the OCS rules, and the guy was acknowledging. He didn't name it, but he said the burrito as big as your head. I don't know that he was specifically referring to Chipotle, but the only thing that I can think of as far as a burrito as big as your head is Chipotle. Anyway, just thought that'd be another interesting topic. Perhaps you guys might add to the list. What types of food go well with what types of games? What else? I did manage to pull the trigger on something, and I've been eyeballing this Destruction of Army Group Center, this old game from 1973, SPI. You can get it as a flat tray, or you can get it in the strategy and tactics form, and that would be issue 36. And also, I found this by mistake. You can go online, and I might post this for you guys, the link. In fact, I most likely will. But it's the entire issue. And when I say the entire issue, I mean this thing includes the map and the counters, as well as every page of the issue. And you can print it out. And thought about doing that, but just didn't feel like aligning it and getting everything to match up and blowing the ink that it would take. Ink is not cheap. So I thought, crap, I'll just order the thing, and well, that's what I did. So, Destruction of Army Group Center in the strategy and tactics form should be arriving in a few days, courtesy of Noble Knight, who I think is having a sale, by the way, 10% off sale, so you might look at that. And also, I want to remind you guys that when I talk about a game company, or even a game for that matter, I am, at least as of yet, I've not been paid a single cent to name drop a game or review something favorably or spend more time on a company or a company at all. I do this of my own accord and not at anybody's behest. So no money is involved, and so what I say is from the heart. And uh, also, I'm just trying to provide a wide variety of information for you guys, as that was one of the original mission statements of this show. Is there's so many sites and so many things to see and do. I had hoped to kind of combine a lot of that stuff into one single format to save you guys the time of searching here and there for information, and so that's what I've done. But as far as news, as we segue to that topic, looks like MMP has posted some information specifically regarding Dien Bien Phu, which I will leave it up to the Dien Bien Phu diehards to go and find out, as I've done a couple of notifications regarding this. And then GMT talks a bit about Console World Expo and how much of a blast it was and how much of a loser I am for not going and everything, and that's great. But they also talk about Mark Simonich using the expo to unveil his newest design, a Civil War strategic game whose origins harken back to Eric Lee Smith's Civil War from Victory Games, which was intriguing. Also, Twilight Struggle is back in stock. Not even sure why I announced that. And the Fall GMT weekend at the warehouse will be held October 16th through 19th. So, any of you that live in the neighborhood can come join them this fall for 3 to 4 days of gaming fun at the GMT warehouse. And at the last weekend at the warehouse, they say in April, they had about 80 participants and had a blast. To sign up for the event, and this is a registration fee of $25, which they don't charge until the start of the event. You need to contact their office, and office ladies, they say, no office men, I guess, via phone, online chat, or email to reserve your spot. And then shipping their next P500 shipments will begin around the 20th of June, and that includes basically the Panzer Expansion number 3, Drive to the Rhine. And then there's a couple new P500 editions. The WBC board game. And yes, they have made a game about a gaming convention. And the 6 turns of WBC, the board game, each one represents a day at the convention. Players must manage their time wisely, contesting convention events in a quest for laurels and competing for the ultimate prize, the title of Caesar. A game for 3 to 5 players, so don't try to play this solitaire unless you want to lose your mind. And then Wing Leader, I don't know about this. But anyway, massed air combat in World War II, flights and squadrons, and a unique side-scrolling game of interception and bombing. So there's that as well. And then reprints. Looks like the next immediate reprint that is due up is Commands and Colors Ancients, expansions 2 and 3. That brings us to, and if I'm moving rather rapidly, I'm not going to apologize. It is intentional because I have a lot of information to cover, and you'll know more what I mean in a second. So anyway, that brings us to our top 10, and this would be the top 10 Napoleonic games, and I will start with number 10, La Bataille de Quatre Bras, 1991, Ed Wimble, Clash of Arms games, just one in a whole string of La Bat games that are played by a lot of people. A lot of people swear by them. I guess a lot of people swear at them, depending on your perception. But good stuff. Number 9, Fading Glory, came out in 2012. This is a GMT production of a Victory Point Games game from the latter's Napoleonic 20 series. And good for, I guess, good for Victory Point Games that GMT picked them up. Number 8, Napoleon, the Waterloo Campaign, 1815. And I know absolutely nothing about this game. Which brings us, moving right along, to number 7, the Napoleonic Wars, the second edition. And I should add that this list is according to the Board Game Geek community. Number 6, Empires in Arms, an oldie but a goodie, 1983, Pender and Rolland, And I think this was an Australian design group, but perhaps more well known in its Avalon Hill form. A trusted game, you can't go wrong with this. Number 5, Bonaparte at Marengo, Bowen Simmons, 2005. And this was I guess you could call it almost a precursor to a later game that is maybe more celebrated than this, though this should not exist necessarily in the shadow of the other. Number 4, Maneuver, a game that, unless you're a beginner or want something light, I would avoid. Number 3, Field Commander Napoleon, is what it says. If you want to perhaps place yourself in Napoleon's shoes, well, here is your opportunity with Field Commander Napoleon. That brings us to number 2, Commands and Colors Napoleonics, Richard Board, 2010 GMT. And it seems like yesterday that this thing came out. But no, 2010, he started his Commands and Colors Napoleonic series. I was a little skeptical, but was able to uphold a certain suspension of reality and learned to like this game quite a bit. And I've talked about it in the past, so I won't go into it in depth here. But it's a great game, and it's a little light, but compared to something like Maneuver, oh, it's 10 times better. Sorry, but it is, and a lot of fun. So number 1, this should be no surprise, Napoleon's Triumph, Bowen Simmons again, 2007. And I have lauded this game and paraded this game. I don't know what else I can do, but to continue to do that. It is a fantastic, wonderful game that anybody and everybody should own, whether you're a fan of Napoleon or not. Really, bottom line, just buy it. And don't just buy it, play it. It is a fantastic game. If you're still holding out, if you're still skeptical, stop. Life is too short. Get this thing and play it. Then move on. If you don't like it, then you have a reason not to like it because you played it and tried it. But just try it. Finally, I guess by way of honorable mention, I'll say also La Bataille de Moscow, the Clash of Arms version to that list. This thing is just beautiful and vast in scope. A wonderful thing. I'm glad it happened. And then finally, War and Peace by Mark McLaughlin, 1980, Avalon Hill, a game that I have spent many an evening with. A great game, a classic. So check that out if you haven't yet. And then that brings us to the Situation Room. And I will preface this by saying that there's a book I have name dropped in the past in a show or two, and this would be the book Campaigns of Napoleon by Mr. Chandler. I've gotten this book again. I own it, but like so many of the things I own, it's in storage in St. Louis. Luckily, as I live next to a university library, they have a copy, so I checked out their copy, skimmed through it again for old time's sake because it's such a great thing. It's deep with information. But I took a specific chapter, and this would be the Napoleon's Art of War chapter. And this thing runs about, I don't know, 60 something pages. So I'm reading through this thing, and I thought, I really want to share this. I want people to hear this stuff, and I don't know that everybody has the time to read it, or, you forget about things. So I thought, I guess I'll kind of force you to hear it, unless you don't listen to this thing. But I've taken these 60 some odd pages and condensed them to about 9. And what I've done is squeezed out the important stuff. Now, I should probably also add that typically in one of these shows, I will follow up the history segment with a game or games, break them down, dissect them. That won't be happening this show. This is quite a bit of material to cover. It takes a lot of time. I'll go back to that routine in the next show. But I thought I would stick primarily just with this stuff. And I'm also going to say, by way of disclaimer, and I'll get this out of the way and then we can move on, that if you're looking for juicy little morsels and tidbits of Napoleon's campaigns, you ain't going to hear it here. This is something else. This is the bare bones of Napoleon, and stripped of the ornamental flesh that is, like I said, the battle accounts and the war stories. What you got here is the skeletal strategy and tactics. Okay, some of you might find it boring. Some might even find it inspiring. So if you're looking for the campfire stories of glory, then this may not be for you. But if you're looking for a breakdown of how Napoleon conducted those famous battles, then this is for you. What is more, after hearing this, you should even be able to take and apply a lot of the same stuff to your own gaming strategies. So, without further ado, I will begin with the major segment of this show. And, guys, as I have said in the past, just sit back and enjoy. So, why war? And I think, if I remember right, yeah, this will be my paragraph, the opening, and then I think the last paragraph is mine. But the rest of it really is just paraphrased and quoted from the book. So, why war? What is the attraction? What is the appeal when it comes to this horrible human invention? Clausewitz said, "War makes rattling good history, but peace is poor reading." And I suppose you could amend this to read, "War makes rattling good games, but peace is poor gaming." But if you look at this closer, from a gamer's perspective, there is a fundamental desire to better understand this human aspect, and reading only takes you so far. To game history, and specifically war, is to gain a particular perspective that you would otherwise never attain. It's one thing to read the words, it's quite another to actually place yourself in the same position as the commanders of old and ponder the same tactical strategic situations that they pondered. Which brings us to our area of concentration, the commander. History boasts a hall of fame of commanders, and each has his own way of waging war, but perhaps no other commander has commanded the attention that Napoleon has, and as such, it would only make sense to become, even if only briefly, students of his methods. Now, Napoleon never really formulated a precise system as such, and this was intentional, as he wanted to keep his contemporaries always guessing, but also because he was practical rather than theoretical. Napoleon is quoted as saying the principles of war are the same as those of a siege. Fire must be concentrated on a single point, and as soon as the breach is wide, the equilibrium is broken and the rest is nothing. The key to this phrase being to upset the enemy's balance, so he never really held to a rigid set of principles, but evolved and amended his ideas continually to meet particular situations. Additionally, theory works up until a certain point, but Napoleon always felt that actions spoke louder than words. So surprisingly, Napoleon added little by way of originality, and for the most part, he really only developed and perfected the ideas of others. He was a devourer of books, taking the best from a range of sources and combining it all into his own way, if you will. He digested a plethora of commanders, including but not limited to Alexander the Great, Caesar, and Frederick the Great. And through these readings, he learned as much from their mistakes as their victories. See, Napoleon was able to break out of the dusty mold that had encapsulated the 18th century with its gentlemanly military conventions, and agreed with Frederick the Great in that wars should be short and lively, not long protracted things. And I think perhaps some contemporary nations might do well to bear this in mind, but in all, perhaps Napoleon was more comfortable in Frederick the Great's way of war, for when you read any number of Frederick's tenets, it sounds as though one is in fact describing Napoleon. Compel the enemy to fight you on your approach, then via forced march place yourself in his rear and cut his communications, or menace a town whose preservation is vital to him. But take care lest you be placed in the same inconvenient situation. Frederick condemned the wars of position and territorial aggrandizement, and Napoleon wholly agreed, for in the 1770s, maneuvering was the exception rather than the rule. Additionally, it was of vital importance to seize and keep the initiative. Napoleon's style was that of limitless variation and flexibility. He'd rather go on the offensive than sit back and wait for your adversary to attack. At the same time, you shouldn't just attack for the sake of attacking. An attack should stem from a strong center of operations with secure communications. Ever the student of learning, when Napoleon had any foreknowledge of a particular campaign, he would immediately read everything he could get his hands on regarding his foe's geography and history, and often, when able, preparing 3 and even 4 months in advance. He'd plan his course of action by considering the worst possible scenario and then figure out how to overcome it. but he never had anything written in stone and always had an alternate plan. He preferred calculations and tried not to allow chance too much influence, working any factor of uncertainty or accident into his equations to the best of his ability. Now, how did he do this? Concealment of one's own strength and intentions. Napoleon was a master of deception. Before his advancing columns, he'd put up a cavalry screen through which enemy patrols couldn't penetrate. And I guess you could cite Austerlitz as a case in point. Napoleon also had a habit of altering the composition of his major formations, adding a division here, taking away a brigade there. As such, the enemy never really had an up to date, accurate picture of his unit's strength or placement. And another important aspect of this era is locating the enemy, as you very well can't fight him if you can't find him, right? And regarding this, Wellington said the whole art of war consists of getting at what lies on the other side of the hill, deciding what we do not know from what we know. So Napoleon would send cavalry in ahead of the army, and they did this in order to scour villages, emptying post boxes, capturing prisoners, and he did all this to get information and figure out where the enemy was not in order to determine where the enemy would be. And when the enemy was located, Napoleon moved with a rabbit-like swiftness, immediately engaging his adversary with speed. If one were to turn Napoleon into an equation, it might read N equals S plus M, or Napoleon equals speed plus mobility. His grumbling grognards groaned that the Emperor has discovered a new way of making war. He makes use of our legs instead of our bayonets. And this was in stark contrast to the contemporary prevailing leisurely tradition. One example of this may be in order. Summoned from Vienna to join Napoleon at Austerlitz, Davout marched the leading division of 3rd Corps well over 140 kilometers in just over 48 hours. 35 of them were spent marching. Indeed, for Napoleon, wars are marches, and three things made this possible: the self-contained, more or less independent French divisional corps system, also not having long, slow-moving supply lines, and Napoleon was a big fan of living off the countryside. Finally, you had Napoleon's sheer will and charisma as a leader. In gaming terms, I guess you could say he had a very high command rating. So Napoleon was brilliant in calculating time in relation to space, and for him, strategy was the art of mastering this. He was reported as saying, "We can recover space, but time never. I may lose a battle," he says, "but never a minute." Regarding time, his troops marched an average of 10 to 12 miles a day and were capable of even further distances as circumstances dictated. The secret to his time-saving skill was through using the shortest and most practicable routes. This was less taxing on his troops, and the time saved allowed for dealing with unforeseen incidents or a changing of plans. Yet strategic movement is by no means easy. And try and coordinate the daily movements of a dozen or so major formations, all moving along separate routes and ensuring that each component is within 1 or 2 days' march distance of each other, while presenting an overall appearance of an ill-coordinated scatter of units in order to deceive your foe. And you begin to get a general idea of just what it's like. Napoleon also had a knack for being able to look at a map and then from that see the terrain that lie ahead of him perfectly in his mind. Though perhaps not completely accurate, Burigny's account of Napoleon during the Italian campaign of 1800 is interesting nonetheless. He describes Napoleon as lying full length on the floor, pushing colored pins into his map and saying, quote, "I shall fight him here on the plain of Scrivia," end quote. The result of this, of course, would be one of his greatest victories, that of Marengo. Though neither Austerlitz or Jena, for that matter, were not exactly foreseen, on nearly every campaign, Napoleon knew the outcome of both his and his enemy's moves through a calculation of all odds. Napoleon continually strove for a favorable battle situation, focusing primarily on assembly and concentration. But sheer numbers alone were not enough, for dispersal before action was as important as concentration in action. And before a battle, it was more important for troops to be assembled rather than concentrated. And to assemble was to place his troops within marching distance of the intended place of battle. This would further allow an outflanking force on either wing he saw fit, without causing any major reorganization. So the corps also had to be flexibly disposed to meet any unforeseen events. Additionally, Napoleon also did his best to disguise the approach from which his coming storm would advance. Typically, Napoleon would cast his formations in a wide front. This would confuse the enemy as to the main point of impact. This also allowed Napoleon to trap the enemy whenever he chose to mass, thus allowing him to adjust his plan accordingly. He escaped any commitment to one primary course of action. Perhaps more importantly, though, this would cause his adversary to do likewise in an attempt to cover all sectors of the wide French front, which made it easier for Napoleon to chop them up piecemeal. And as the battle gained momentum, Napoleon's front would narrow. Also, this front could expand and contract as needed, which only served to confuse the enemy. And it was precisely this type of strategic flexibility made possible by the Corps d'Armée system and a logistical system that didn't create any drag that comprised one great secret of his overall success. Napoleon stated, "The army must be kept assembled and the greatest possible force concentrated on the battlefield." Thus, initial dispersion gave way to carefully phased concentration as the time of battle approached. One tactic he employed was to delude his opponent into a false sense of security by holding back most of his corps at a 2-day march from the planned point of impact, then, quote, steal, end quote, a day's march that night. The next morning, the enemy would be forced to do battle 24 hours before the expected time when all of his forces had yet to gather. Napoleon fluidly fused marching, fighting, and pursuing into one continuous process, unlike his forebears, who compartmentalized these activities. But again, the core system is key here, allowing rapid movement and any neighboring unit to quickly come to the aid of the other. Napoleon retained much of what he had learned and remembered. Guibert, who had said, "The art is to extend one's forces without exposing them, to embrace the enemy without becoming disunited, to link up the moves or the attack, to take the enemy in flank without exposing your own." Napoleon was extremely cognizant of surprise and was often able to use this tactic to defeat the enemy, for he knew that a surprised enemy was also a demoralized one, and as such, he was familiar with the intricacies of morale and warfare. Believing morale a more decisive factor than sheer numbers, Napoleon sought his men's affection as well as their respect. He engendered courage and perseverance in his officers and believed glory a more efficient motivator than coin. And there's a quote, I can't remember verbatim, but he says something to the effect that it's amazing what a soldier will do for a red ribbon. And it's true. He often joined troops gathered round a campfire and recognized various faces, calling them out for praise. He also had the advancement system, and he would reward achievement, allowing people to move up through the ranks. Wellington used to say of Napoleon, "His presence on the field made a difference of 40,000 men. But if he was able to bolster the morale of his own troops, he was simultaneously able to dismantle the morale of his adversary, and he did this through speed, surprise, and a relentless offense. He would often play a particular commander's known weaknesses against him. And maybe the most important principle, however, when it comes to any kind of Napoleonic recipe, as it were, for success, would be the unity of command. One of the first things Napoleon did was to do away with the semi-autonomous armies and centralized all formations into one single army with him at the head. Now, this might sound megalomaniacal, and perhaps it is, but it was also effective. Unity of command, said Napoleon, was the first necessity in war, stating that it wasn't necessarily the Roman army that defeated Gaul, but Caesar. Not that maintaining effective control over a widely deployed army or series of armies was easy. Remember, this is a time in which there is no telegraph, and the speed of communication, specifically when it comes to orders, was really only as fast as your fastest horse. And then there was still no guarantee that they would even get there. Thus, oftentimes, Napoleon's orders simply couldn't transcend the physical problem of distance. So, again, Napoleon invented little by way of new developments, and his particular way of war drew heavily from three pre existing conditions. The first one would be the idea of subdividing armies into permanent self contained divisions. The second would be with such a huge army, long supply trains were simply unfeasible, so living off the countryside was encouraged. And I think only really in 1812 did Napoleon succumb to an advanced supply line, and then with limited success. But prior to Napoleon, looting was looked down on, more or less. It just wasn't a gentlemanly thing to do, and troops weren't trusted to forage as they might simply never come back. But with an army of volunteers, foraging could be taken advantage of with little fear of desertion, and there was also an inherent ideology at work here as well. You had the new French soldier who believed he was defending the revolution against foreign intervention, while also believing that he was spreading the new gospel of liberty and equality. So that brings us to number three, a promotion system open to talent. And as such, natural leaders arose through the ranks rather than being picked according to birth or financial status. And it was these leaders, the Davout, the Marats, the Lannes, who were the ones that faithfully and capably transformed Napoleon's will into reality. So that brings us to strategic concepts. And you have to remember, Napoleon had no set specific ruled pattern. And I presume this only aided in disallowing his adversaries from being able to accurately predict just what he would do next. But nevertheless, underlying each campaign was a faintly visible fundamentalism of ideas, which were applied according to circumstance. For Napoleon, basically every battle could be broken down into three parts: move into contact, battle, and pursuit and exploitation. He also laid down five principles for opening a campaign. The first one being an army must have only a single line of operations. The target must be clearly defined, and every possible formation directed toward the target must be clearly defined in every possible formation directed towards it. Not that one single road of approach should be used, but rather by various routes. Namely, men shouldn't be wasted on secondary operations. And two, the main enemy army should always be the objective. This may seem obvious, but it's easy enough to become sidetracked with things whose importance at that particular moment may seem monumental, but are in fact mere distractions from the main event. And how many times have we done this? Getting sidetracked by something and losing sight of the overall objective. Number three, move in such a way as to place yourself on the enemy's flank and rear. Four, strive to turn the enemy's most exposed flank. Cut him off from his depots, neighboring forces, or his capital. And number five, keep your own lines of communication safe and open. Napoleon also employed three different types of strategic maneuver to achieve these aims. And that would be one, the advance of envelopment, otherwise known as the indirect approach. And two, his strategy of the central position, followed by three, strategic penetration. And advance of envelopment was designed to crush a single enemy army, which had strayed out of close supporting distance of its allies or supporting forces. See, Napoleon disliked having to march directly into the enemy to fight on ground of his, that is to say, the enemy's choosing, as these are costly and risky. Case in point, Borodino. Whenever possible, Napoleon, after pinning the foe frontally by a feint attack, would then march his main army by the quickest possible route hidden by cavalry and natural terrain to place himself on the rear or flank of his opponent, and then ordered the blocking of all crossings, and thus isolated his intended victim from his rear depots and reduced his chances of reinforcement. He then advanced relentlessly towards the foe's army and had the advantage of now fighting on ground of his choosing. And it's important that the penning force in this scenario be of sufficient force to defy the enemy for a definite period of time, as Napoleon was also careful to provide his secondary attack with a safe refuge whenever possible, say for instance within or behind a fort or river line. But even if the opponent were able to overcome the penning force and even gain ground, the enemy would only be placing a greater distance between himself and his original bases, not to mention He'd now be operating in hostile territory with Napoleon sweeping up against his rear. So neither did it matter if the opponent struck against the French communications. To do so, he'd have to split his force, part to watch the pinning force, part to cover his rear against Napoleon's approach, and the rest for the actual operation. But remember, Napoleon was far less vulnerable when it came to his communications than his opponent due to living off the land. So Napoleon deliberately kept his communication lines short, and whenever his troops marched more than 6 days from his center of operations, he just relocated them to a more forward position. So if the opponent simply decided to march and give battle, he was only playing into Napoleon's hands by fighting on unfamiliar turf with a shaken morale and most likely with his formation scattered by the chaos of and muddle of a precipitate withdrawal. Napoleon could handle nearly anything save the intervention of another army or strong reinforcements, and even then a corps could simply be detached to watch and block a probable line of approach. In a nutshell, advance of envelopment consisted of seizing the initiative, throwing the enemy off balance by cutting his communications, and then destroying him by a combo of physical encirclement and a psychological frustration. But when it came to the advance of envelopment, a chink in Napoleon's strategic armor was revealed, for after conducting this tactic for some time, finally late in 1813, somewhere thereabouts, his adversaries began to know what to expect and plan accordingly, and armies began to employ superior numbers who carried a considerable amount of supplies and simply ignored Napoleon's harassing rear action, focusing instead on the pre-established objective. But again, this idea of advance of envelopment didn't originate with Napoleon. You have to remember, its roots can be found in Frederick the Great specifically. The central position, regarding central position, more often than not, Napoleon faced more than one army. And when this was the case, he employed a second system of maneuver, that of the central position. So Napoleon would isolate one part of the enemy, concentrating on a stronger force to defeat it, and then turn with his full strength to attack the second enemy army. So rather than a single decisive blow, he planned a series of smaller strikes against scattered adversaries and set out to destroy them in detail. But how is this done? Napoleon would first gather information about his opponents, then use the data to plot their known dispositions on a map and select the place where their respective armies met. This was the hinge of the enemy's strategic disposition and also the most vulnerable point. Here Napoleon would strike first in full strength, shielded by cavalry, and split them in two, essentially creating a central space from which he could strike. Then, rather than use his entire strength to face one army while ignoring the other, the French army would split into three components: a left wing, a right wing, and a central reserve. Next, he would safely relocate his center of operations and focus on isolating his first intended victim. This was carried out by the nearest wing, which would at once march to make contact, and being a pinning move. At the same time, the reserve would move up in its support and attempt to undertake a tactical outflanking move or simply reinforce the front as needed. Meanwhile, the remaining wing would be marching off to serve as a corps to observation in order to prevent any outside intervention. And as this role was not primarily defensive, they were to press a full attack and pin the second army. After the first army was defeated, Napoleon would detach a portion of his victorious force to pursue the remnants from the field and then set out with the rest to repeat the same formula against the second army. Now, it's important to note here that the above can be variated in as many ways as needed to the situation at hand, and it often was. But a further chink in Napoleon's strategic armor pops up, and this was his inability to be everywhere that he was needed. He's only human, but if you could reduce the French army into multiple disconnected parts, it would be far more difficult for Napoleon to conduct effective and timely command and control. Furthermore, for Napoleon to have to turn from one defeated army to another, this also ruled out pursuit and utter annihilation. Then you have strategic penetration regarding this. Whenever Napoleon faced a cordon line type of defense, he just smashed through it, found a convenient place, and followed it up with a rapid march deep into enemy territory to seize some town or city for use as his own center of operations. So this alone wasn't enough to win a battle, but it provided a springboard from which to launch a full campaign. So of the three, Napoleon would graft one onto the other as needed, and as Chandler states, Napoleonic War was nothing if not complex, an ever shifting kaleidoscope of moves and intentions, which by themselves went a long way towards baffling and dazing his muddled, conventionally minded opponents into the state of disconcerting moral disequilibrium, which so often resulted in their catastrophic defeat. And if I do say so myself, some fine military poetry. But that brings us to a closer view of Napoleon, and this would be via grand tactics on the battlefield. And this deals with troops, cavalry, and artillery during the crucial moves once contact with the enemy ensues. As with his strategy, Napoleon made few original contributions to tactics. As in strategy, so too, tactics should be fluid and incorporate surprise. Again, Napoleon borrows from the likes of Frederick and others, but also differs with some of them, specifically regarding artillery. And he says it is necessary to have as much artillery as the enemy, for experience shows it's necessary to have 4 guns to every 1,000 men. And Napoleon agreed with Dutil that big batteries are the true secret of victory. Similar to his strategic methods, he studied the tactics of his day and took the best from a wide range of ideas and formulated a series of alternatives organized around a central theme. To dissect his tactical mind, one would find the bulk of it dedicated to offense. Napoleon rarely went on the defensive, and here we find yet another chink in his armor. For those who refused to counterattack and remain on the defensive ultimately fared better against Napoleon. But as important as attack is, of equal importance is equilibrium. And if the enemy could be thrown off balance and kept off balance, all the better. Here again, Napoleon learned much about an opposing general and used their weaknesses against them. As well, much like in his strategic thinking, so too did he employ envelopment within his tactics. Flank attacks were championed as precursors to victory, as little did more to dampen the morale of an army than to hear the rumbling of cannon or see a large cloud of dust toward his flank and rear. And I want you guys to think about that as you're moving forward. Your thoughts, your intentions are focused in a forward manner and direction, and to be suddenly faced with something that was previously not considered, that is to say, an approaching army on your left or your right, or even coming up from behind, would almost assuredly and immediately throw you off, more accurately, throw you off balance. And this just reverberates through the entire formation and also allows the person that is flanking or attacking you from the rear to double that up with a more intense frontal assault. And more oftentimes than not, a complete retreat would ensue, or worse, a complete dispersal and slaughter. But yeah, to be focused on one thing and then suddenly be faced with another, how to deal with it, what to do. I only had this one thing to worry about. Now I have this as well. Which is more important? Which is more of a threat? You don't have time to think about all this stuff. It just happens. And the reaction that the flank attack and a rear attack causes is priceless. It really plays into the attacker's hand if he can pull it off. And Napoleon was a master at this. He pulled this off left and right, no pun intended. Specifically, there's an important variation to Napoleon's turning of an enemy's flank with aid of an independent force when troops were insufficient. This was known as the tactical outflanking movement. The difference between a turning and a tactical flanking maneuver really rested in the fact that a turning movement could be executed only by at least a corps-sized force, which was capable of moving into action independently of the main body. If properly timed, this could be decisive if the turning force was able to place itself well into the enemy's rear to counter any retreat. An outflanking movement was carried out by a formation forming an integral part of the French battle line. At all times, it remained linked to the main front, never becoming separate. This could cause an enemy to change front or partially redeploy his line, but it rarely led to any knockout type blow. And as with strategy, the tactical key also rests in timing. Timing. From concentration to appearance of the turning force to crucial bombardment of the key enemy sector to the loosing of the main attack. This all hinged on timing. You could do any and all of these, but they were never guaranteed success unless they were well timed. As with maneuver, there are three forms of battle that stand out, and all could be combined or variated as needed. And these consist of one, a battle based on simple frontal attacks, two, the double battle, and finally three, the enveloping or strategic battle, which was Napoleon's favorite. Regarding the frontal attack, this consisted of two armies slugging away at each other, just battling it out, a kind of attritional type thing, and Napoleon was not typically a fan of this. Not only was it wasteful and costly when it came to men, it allowed the enemy to retreat unhindered along his own line of communication. And then when you talk about the double battle, which was often used in conjunction with frontal and strategic battles, this invariably played a part in the unfolding strategy of the central position, and this was often used if the field of battle was divided in two by some geographical anomaly or the like. So, Napoleon's ideal type of action was called the norm, and his ideal battle centered around the concept of an enveloping attack designed to shaken the enemy's nerve and weaken his main battle line at a pre-selected point. So Napoleon continually emphasized that it was by turning the enemy, by attacking his flank, that battles are won, and for this was the means of creating a breach in the enemy's battle line, and once this occurred, the equilibrium broke. But we can't forget that the timing and coordination of this masterstroke was of the utmost importance. The subsequent pursuit was no less important, and thus envelop, breakthrough, and an exploitation formed the core of Napoleon's strategic battle. Everything else was just used to facilitate these three things. A typical strategic battle consisted of a report from his cavalry screen that the enemy was massed, at which point Napoleon would order the nearest major formation to make contact with the enemy and pin him down. Then the core system also allowed smaller units to take on larger ones and hold their own for quite some time. This was because each corps had its own infantry, cavalry, and guns, and this was not typically done prior to this. It was almost like each corps was its own little army, and one of Napoleon's corps could hold out for an entire day if it had to, until a neighboring corps could march to its support. Many a time did the enemy wrongfully assess a certain corps as dwindling, as being worn down, when in fact it was just buying time until the next corps could come to support it. Eventually, the enemy commander would realize it was he who was being worn down, and before he knew it, in an attempt to finish off what appeared to be a dwindling corps, he had oftentimes thrown everything into it, including the reserves, in an effort to regain the momentum and finish this corps off. And this is exactly what Napoleon wanted. He wanted this to happen because he knew that ultimately he would emerge the victor. Meanwhile, Napoleon would have already considered the lie of the foe's natural line of retreat and attacked the flank that lay nearest to this. Screened by cavalry, an enveloping force would then be sent towards said enemy flank or even the rear, and here speed was of the utmost importance. So, judging the correct moment for the enveloping force to reveal itself was, needless to say, critical. It shouldn't occur before the enemy had committed all or most of his reserves to the frontal battle, and the signal to commit this action would either be by cannon or written order, depending on distance. Once the enemy commander realized what was happening, he had one of two courses of action. He could order an immediate retreat, although this was often not possible as Napoleon would launch a general frontal attack, or he could relocate troops to form a new line of defense. And as all reserves would already be committed, typically, or according to Napoleon, hopefully, troops would have to be pulled from frontal areas closest to the threat, and this thinning out of the front is exactly what Napoleon called the event. Now, Napoleon could unleash fresh troops for a decisive surprise attack against the newly weakened hinge of the enemy's battle line, such that breakthrough and the rupture of the enemy into two separate entities would ensue. In anticipation of this, Napoleon would have already been amassing a, quote, mass de rupture, end quote, behind a topographical feature, or as at Austerlitz, also behind the cover of fog. Timing was key. The enemy had to have sufficiently weakened himself at the appointed sector before the main attack was unleashed, and when it was, case shot ripped through the enemy lines as columns of infantry advanced, then formed into line to finish off the shocked lines of foe with bayonet. This would then be followed by cavalry charges, which would cause the enemy to form squares, which could then do little against advancing infantry columns. Horse artillery was brought in to blast these juicy point blank targets, and as a result, a gaping hole would form through which cuirassiers and carbineers and mounted grenadiers of the guard would thunder through. And once the breach was made, the battle was pretty much won. But you still had the exploitation phase, and Napoleon didn't allow any moment of respite for either side after a victory. And before this, a lot of the maneuvering of armies was just that, maneuvering of armies. You flex your muscles. Somebody gets flanked, somebody gets pinned, and the army retreats into the battle. And Napoleon would keep pressing the issue. He wouldn't just stop and say, "Hey, I could have slaughtered you. I won." He proceeded to do it. He proceeded to follow up the victory. Over anybody that was retreating, he pursued them. He wanted to annihilate these armies because he didn't want to have to fight them again. It sounds barbaric or mean, or but again, he didn't want to face this army again. He wanted to do it this one time and be done with them. And to let an army just walk off into the sunset was ridiculous, and he thought of it that way. So often these pursuits wound up deep into enemy territory, which would further shock and demoralize any surrounding or surviving formations. So he would send in the light cavalry and the dragoons, as well as horse artillery and columns of infantry after the retreating armies to finish the job. And oftentimes this penetration and exploitation was blitzkrieg by definition, and you have to consider that this was taking place well over a century before Hitler would be credited for such a thing. Perhaps part of Napoleon's winning formula, though, is that all the above was capable of instant, on the spot modification as needed. He didn't comprise a plan and follow it to the letter. He allowed for things to pop up, anomalies, and he planned accordingly. He expected the unexpected to pop up. In conclusion, and this is where I wrap this up, Napoleon was not a master innovator, and I mentioned this. He did little by way of creating completely new strategy or tactics. Most of his stuff had already existed, was already out there. If it was even already being used to some extent. He was, however, more often than not, a master of time. He was almost always able to have time play into his hands. He never wasted time. He used it extremely wisely. But also, his equations for victory factored in the unexpected, chance, as well as accident, so that when they inevitably popped up, he was ready for it. His charisma as a leader was priceless, but perhaps most valuable was his non formulaic type of formula. Though recurring battle motifs can be pulled from his resume, these were often interchanged and variated as needed to suit the ever changing battlefield conditions, and this kept his competitors always on their toes. They were constantly guessing. But no man is completely random, nor in Napoleon's case would he particularly want to be. It was only natural to repeat what worked, and almost unavoidably his adversaries would eventually learn. not only from their mistakes, but from Napoleon's victories. His advance of envelopment was eventually used against him, and the lucky ones learned to be patient defensively against Napoleon rather than freak out and mount a hasty counterattack, which always played into his hands. Also, as much as he may have desired to be, he simply couldn't be everywhere at once. Finally, though his subordinates proved more than capable time and time again, they just weren't him, and there was no substitution. So it's ironic to think that he himself would ultimately suffer in the end from bad timing or poor judgment while getting spoon fed his own tactical medicine. Yet this is precisely what occurred at a place called Waterloo. But that's a story for another time. And that pretty much wraps up Napoleon. And as I said, that is a bare bones account of his strategy and tactics. And I should probably add that it was also a one sided view, and it presents Napoleon as not only commander, but commander of time, commander of chance, commander. It makes it sound as though everything was under his command, and it wasn't necessarily so. In fact, if you want a different angle on this, I would highly recommend a book called Blundering to Glory, which talks about just that, how Napoleon is mistakenly perceived as this great master of fate. Yeah, it's a great read, and it's not very long. I highly recommend it for a completely different perspective. But yeah, I just wanted to focus, like I said, mostly on the bare bones strategy and tactics that made Napoleon what he was. And hopefully you guys enjoyed it, and hopefully you can take some of this stuff and apply it to your own Napoleonic gaming. So that's it. And as far as what's on tap, I think I'm going to land back in World War II territory for the next show. But that's it. So thanks for listening and keep gaming.